On August 15, 1955, 20-year-old Elvis Presley sat in a small office in Memphis, Tennessee, facing a decision that would define the rest of his life. Across the desk sat Colonel Tom Parker, a carnival barker-turned-music manager with a Dutch accent he tried to hide and a past he never discussed. Between them lay a contract that would give Parker control of Elvis's career for the next 22 years. Elvis was young, ambitious, and completely out of his depth. He'd had some regional success with Sun Records, but he was still driving a truck for Crown Electric Company to pay his bills. His family lived in public housing. His mother Gladys did laundry and worked odd jobs. His father Vernon struggled to find steady work. The Presleys were poor, and they'd been poor for generations. Colonel Parker represented opportunity. He had connections in the music industry. He knew how to promote artists, how to get them on television, how to turn regional success into national fame. He'd managed Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow, both major country stars. And now he wanted to manage Elvis Presley. But the contract Parker presented wasn't standard. Most managers took 10 to 15% of an artist's earnings. Parker wanted 25%, and not just from live performances, but from everything: recordings, merchandising, movies, endorsements. Every dollar Elvis earned, Parker would take a quarter of it. "That seems like a lot," Elvis said, looking at the numbers. "It's what I'm worth," Parker said calmly. "I'm going to make you the biggest star in the world. But that takes work. That takes connections. That takes my full attention, and that's worth 25%. Elvis wanted to talk to his parents before signing anything this important. Wanted to have a lawyer look at the contract and explain what all the legal language actually meant. Wanted time to think, to compare this offer with other potential opportunities, to understand if 25% was reasonable or exploitative. But Parker applied pressure in ways that were subtle and devastating and perfectly calibrated to Elvis's deepest insecurities. "There are other artists I could manage," Parker said, his tone casual but his message clear. "Young guys with talent, guys who are hungry and ready to work. If you're not interested in moving forward, I completely understand. But I need to know now because I've got meetings scheduled next week in Nashville and New York, and I need to know who I'm promoting, who I'm investing my time and connections in." The message was clear as crystal. Sign now or lose this opportunity forever. And for a poor kid from Tupelo who'd spent his whole life watching opportunities pass his family by, watching his father struggle to find work, watching his mother take in laundry and clean houses, the fear of missing this chance was absolutely overwhelming and paralyzing. Gladys and Vernon were in the waiting room. Elvis went out to talk to them. "He wants 25%, Elvis said. "Is that normal?" Vernon didn't know. He'd never signed a business contract in his life. Gladys just wanted her son to be successful, to have opportunities she'd never had. "If you trust him," Gladys said, "then we trust your judgment." But Elvis didn't trust Parker. He barely knew Parker. What he trusted was his own desperation, his burning desire to escape poverty, to give his parents a better life, to prove that all those people who'd called him trashy and weird had been wrong. Elvis signed the contract. August 15th, 1955. 25% of everything for as long as Parker managed him. It would prove to be the most financially devastating decision of his life. For the first few years, 25% seemed reasonable, even generous considering what Parker delivered. He did exactly what he'd promised, and more. He got Elvis on national television shows that regional artists rarely accessed. He negotiated a deal with RCA Records that paid Elvis $40,000 up front, more money than the Presley family had ever seen in their entire lives combined. He arranged Elvis's first movie contract with Paramount Pictures. He turned Elvis from a regional phenomenon playing small venues in the South into a national sensation selling out arenas and appearing on the most-watched television programs in America. But in 1960, while Elvis was serving in the United States Army and unable to closely monitor his business affairs, Parker renegotiated their contract without Elvis's full understanding of what was happening or the long-term implications. The new agreement gave Parker not 25% of Elvis's earnings, but 50%. Half of everything Elvis made would go directly to Colonel Tom Parker. When Elvis returned from the Army in March 1960 and learned about the new arrangement through conversations with his accountants, he was shocked and felt betrayed. 50%? How did that happen? I don't remember agreeing to that. Parker had an explanation ready, carefully crafted to make Elvis feel guilty for even questioning it. Your career stalled while you were in the Army serving your country. I had to work twice as hard to keep you relevant in the public consciousness, to maintain your brand recognition, to set up opportunities for when you return to civilian life. The increased percentage reflects the increased work and risk I took on while you were unavailable to perform or record. It was a lie, or at least a massive exaggeration, designed to manipulate Elvis's sense of fairness and obligation. Parker had done some work during Elvis's Army service, but nothing that justified doubling his percentage. But Elvis was in no position to argue or push back. He'd been gone for 2 years. His career momentum had indeed suffered during that time, and Parker controlled all the crucial relationships with record labels, movie studios, television networks, concert promoters. If Elvis fired Parker now, he'd be starting from scratch, rebuilding connections that Parker had spent years developing. The thought was terrifying. So Elvis accepted the 50% arrangement, signing paperwork he didn't fully understand, trusting that Parker had his best interests at heart, even though the evidence suggested otherwise. It would remain in place for the rest of his life, draining half of every dollar he earned for the next 17 years until his death in 1977. By the late 1960s, as Elvis approached his mid-30s and had been working professionally for over 15 years, he began to understand with growing horror how badly he was being exploited by the man he'd trusted to guide his career. He'd made millions upon millions of dollars over the years, had been one of the highest-earning entertainers in the world for more than a decade, but he never seemed to have much money available when he needed it. He owned Graceland, owned cars and jewelry and gifts he'd bought for friends and family, but he had constant cash flow problems that didn't make sense given his earnings. He couldn't afford to tour internationally because Parker claimed the logistics were too complicated and expensive, though the real reason was that Parker, who'd entered the United States illegally from the Netherlands decades earlier, had no passport and couldn't leave the country without risking exposure of his immigration status. Elvis started asking difficult questions that Parker didn't want to answer. Where was all his money actually going? Why did he have to keep working constantly, touring and recording and making movies just to maintain his lifestyle when he'd already earned so much? Why couldn't he take significant time off without facing immediate financial panic and creditor pressure? The answers, when he finally got them from accountants and lawyers, were devastating. Colonel Parker was taking 50% of Elvis's gross earnings, not his net earnings. That meant Parker got paid before expenses, before taxes, before anyone else. And Parker had structured deals in ways that benefited himself far more than they benefited Elvis. The movie contracts, for instance. Parker negotiated deals where Elvis got paid a flat fee plus a percentage of profits. But Parker negotiated his own separate fee from the studios, essentially getting paid twice for the same work. Elvis didn't know about these side deals until years later. The merchandising was even worse. Parker had set up companies that licensed Elvis's name and image, and Parker owned significant stakes in these companies. He was paying himself to license Elvis's own name, taking money from both sides of every transaction. By 1973, Elvis wanted out. He'd been working for 18 years under contracts that gave Parker absurd amounts of control and money. He wanted to fire Parker, hire new management, restructure his career in ways that actually benefited him. But Parker had made himself indispensable. He controlled Elvis's relationships with RCA Records, with the movie studios, with concert promoters. If Elvis fired Parker, he'd face lawsuits from dozens of entities claiming Parker had authority to commit Elvis to various deals. The legal battles could take years and cost millions. More importantly, Elvis was deeply in debt despite his massive earnings. Parker had encouraged Elvis to spend lavishly, to buy cars and gifts for friends, to maintain an expensive lifestyle. Elvis owed money to the IRS, to various creditors, to people who'd lent him money when cash flow was tight. He couldn't afford to stop working long enough to sort out the legal and financial mess that firing Parker would create. So Elvis stayed trapped in a contract he'd signed when he was 20 years old, giving half his earnings to a manager who'd systematically exploited him for nearly 2 decades. In August 1973, Parker negotiated the sale of Elvis's entire back catalog to RCA for $5.4 million. Elvis, who'd recorded hundreds of songs over 15 years, would receive $2.7 million. Parker would receive $2.7 million, and Elvis would no longer receive royalties from any of his previous recordings. Every time Hound Dog or Jailhouse Rock or Can't Help Falling in Love played on the radio, Elvis would get nothing. RCA would get everything. Elvis needed the money to pay his debts, so he agreed to the deal. But he understood what it meant. He'd sold his past to survive his present, and he'd done it because Colonel Parker had structured his finances in ways that made him desperate. By 1977, Elvis was performing over 100 concerts a year, often in poor health, struggling with prescription drug addiction just to maintain cash flow. He couldn't stop working because he couldn't afford to stop working. And Colonel Parker kept booking shows, kept taking his 50%, kept treating Elvis like a product to be exploited rather than a human being to be protected. Elvis died on August 16, 1977, at age 42, still under contract to Colonel Parker, still giving away half his earnings, still trapped in an agreement he'd signed 22 years earlier when he was too young and too desperate to understand what he was giving away. After Elvis's death, the full extent of Parker's exploitation became public. Investigations revealed the side deals, the conflicts of interest, the ways Parker had systematically enriched himself at Elvis's expense. In 1980, Vernon Presley sued Parker for mismanagement. The Presley estate eventually settled, but Parker walked away with millions of dollars earned from exploiting Elvis. The contract Elvis signed in 1955 wasn't signed at literal gunpoint. Parker didn't threaten violence, he didn't use physical force, but he used something equally powerful: the desperation of a poor young man who saw one chance to escape poverty and was terrified of losing it. Parker understood that Elvis's biggest vulnerability wasn't his lack of business knowledge, though that was certainly a factor. Elvis's biggest vulnerability was his poverty, his family's poverty, the generations of being poor that made any opportunity seem too precious to negotiate, too valuable to risk by asking questions or demanding better terms. When someone is desperate enough, you don't need a gun to force them to sign terrible contracts. You just need to make them believe this is their only chance, their last chance, the opportunity they'll regret forever if they don't take it right now without thinking too hard about the terms. Elvis Presley was one of the most successful entertainers in history. He sold over 1 billion records. He starred in 31 movies. He performed thousands of concerts. And he died with an estate valued at only about $5 million, a fraction of what he should have accumulated from such a successful career. Where did all the money go? 50% went to Colonel Parker. Much of the rest went to taxes, to maintaining an expensive lifestyle Parker encouraged, to paying off debts that shouldn't have existed for someone earning as much as Elvis earned. And the back catalog, the recordings that should have provided income for Elvis's heirs for decades, had been sold off to pay immediate debts created by years of financial mismanagement. The contract Elvis signed at 20 years old defined his entire life. It limited his artistic choices because Parker only cared about commercial success. It kept him working when he should have been resting. It prevented him from touring internationally, from taking creative risks, from having any real control over his career. And it all started with a simple decision: sign now or lose this chance forever. For a desperate young man from a poor family, that wasn't really a choice at all. It was coercion disguised as opportunity, exploitation disguised as partnership, a trap disguised as a contract. Today, the story of Elvis and Colonel Parker is taught in music business courses as a cautionary tale about artist exploitation. Young musicians are warned about managers who take excessive percentages, who have conflicts of interest, who structure deals to benefit themselves rather than their clients. But the real lesson is deeper. It's about how desperation makes people vulnerable to exploitation, how poverty creates situations where people accept terrible deals because they seem better than the alternatives, how power imbalances in contracts signed when someone is young and naive can define and limit entire lives. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, spent his entire career working for a manager who took half his earnings and gave him back a life of debt, exhaustion, and early death. And it all started with a contract signed in a small office in Memphis, where a desperate young man faced a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life.